Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the south-afrifur Pawdcast. You're listening to myself, Ivic Wolf, here on this wonderful Sunday evening. For the first time in the last 2 weeks, we have a live recording. Not only just live in the fact that both myself and Scratch are in the same studio.
For once.
For once. Beyond that, we also have like our own weird-ass audio interesting things. But for this evening, we have Mary E. Loud, writer of...
Otters in Space, among others.
Among others. That's the third installment now, yeah?
Yes, it's a trilogy now.
Trilogy, yeah. Is it going to be a quintuple?
Quintilogy, quadrilogy.
Depends on, how much response I eventually get to the first three. Mm-hmm. And how much time I have for it.
Yeah, okay. And, as we were talking in sort of like right from the beginning and things like that, I mean, you've been in the fandom for... I guess a fair amount of time.
I think about 8 years.
Yeah, like that's a fair amount of time.
Yeah.
I think. I'm not sure anymore. But yeah. So I mean, like, how did that entire thing start? Like, how, and why the furry fandom?
Well, I've always loved animals, and I read the Redwall books when I was like 10, and it was the best thing in the world. And Watership Down was my absolute favorite book. But then it was hard to find books with talking animals as I kind of aged out of them. So I moved to science fiction and drifted away from that. And then when I started writing seriously after college, I just kept coming back to this idea for a book called Otters in Space, which had started as a joke in college. I'd tell people, yeah, someday I'm going to write a novel and call it Otters in Space. But it was what I really wanted to write more than anything else, even though I couldn't explain to anybody why talking otters. It was like, yes, I want to write hard science fiction with real science ideas. These are going to be cats and dogs and otters, and I don't know why. And people would give me very strange looks.
Okay.
But I wrote it, and then I had to do something with it, and you're always told... look for similar books and then seek out those publishers and agents, except there were no similar books. So I self-published it.
Okay. And
was looking for places to tell people about it online. And I thought, if anybody's still reading Redwall, a Redwall forum might be a good place. And there really weren't Redwall forums. But that led me to Furtopia, which is... it's a furry forum, and I started hanging out there, and it was a nice place. And then people mentioned Rainforest, and that was close enough. I live in Oregon, so that's close enough we could drive up to it. So we took some of my books, my husband and I, and we drove up and went to Rainforest, and there were furry publishers and other furry writers, and a whole dealer's table covered with books with amazing covers. I think they were mostly Gold's books. And just looked, this is the place where I've always belonged. And now, when my mother-in-law looks at me, like, why otters? Writing. And then she would just sort of nod, like, oh, yes, you have other people that are like you. I guess it makes sense if there's a group of you. I don't know why that makes it make more sense, but it does. And so that is what brought them.
Okay.
And that's cool. So for those who might not be too familiar with your works, are there, we mentioned the Otters in Space trilogy. Are there any works that you were working on in previous times?
Well, right now I'm working on a novella spin-off of the Otters in Space trilogy. A friend of mine and I, years ago at this point, were talking about how, so the second book, Otters in Space 2, Jupiter Deadly, when I got the first copy of, this is what the cover will look like, it didn't have a comma. It was Jupiter Deadly, like a name. And so we thought that Jupiter Deadly would be a great name for a detective.
Ooh.
Detective on the moon. And, we just, right?
Space noir
so we ran with
kind
that and changed it to Jove Deadly. And outline where he would write the first novella, and there'd be a MacGuffin in it, and the detective and his brother, other areas, all of their mates are named for planets, and they get into trouble. And my friend actually wrote it, and he wrote it like in my style with my same stupid types of jokes that I love and I think are hilarious, and it was just so much fun to read. So I've been writing the second half where his sister comes, and the MacGuffin from the first story ended up drifting off in the paws of, I think it ended up in the small breed cartel's paws. So in the second half, his sister shows up, and it turns out that it was more important than the brother had realized, and they have to go get it back. And by the end, it'll be revealed what the MacGuffin is. And detective stories are super hard to write. You have to have all of the plot stuff really figured out. So it's taking me a lot longer than I expected.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not the kind of thing that you can make up on the go. I mean, a whodunit, you need to know whodunit from the beginning and work back.
But not just whodunit. Like, I knew that part, but also like all of the other parties that the detective thinks might have done it, and what their motives are, and what it is that they've actually done that makes it look like it could be them. So you've got to have all of the characters worked out, not just throw a character in when you get to the scene and make them up on the spot, which apparently is what I'm used to doing.
All right. So I mean, like, obviously you say that you've been in the fandom for like 8 years now, and this is sort of the kind of introduction that you got from there. Like, I mean, how exactly how did you find the furry fandom when find them as a group, as a people, as those people? How did you sort of like find them? Like, what was the sort of general feeling that you got from them as people?
No, I mean, there's a huge range of people in the furry fandom. I mostly interact with the writers when I've gone to Rainforest and Further Confusion, and now Furlandia. So I mostly hang out with the writers at conventions, and then there's the Furry Writers Guild with its forums and its Slack channel, and there's so many furries on Twitter. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I hang out with them. Not quite sure what you're asking.
No, I mean, like initially as a writer, somebody coming directly into the fandom while trying to sort of publish or self-publish a book and everything like that, was everybody, obviously I would imagine that the Furry Writers Guild would be a very open, inviting place and things like that. But I mean, like, was there ever a point, like, I mean, was there ever a point that people were kind of sitting there, like, maybe asking too much about things, possibly for like short stories that they wanted written? Because I know that I think Kyle Gold at some point mentioned that he sometimes gets mails where people sort of send stories to him to figure out whether they're good or not.
I don't think I've experienced that. I mean, I've done some sort of mentoring through the Furry Writers Guild, like Amy Fontaine, who's managed to sell a story to me for each issue of Roar that I've edited. I've done, some, like, there was a story of hers that I did a couple editing passes with her on, because it came out recently. It's the Moon Fox, lovely story, and she had gotten some interest in it from a pro market. Mm-hmm. So she had me look at it to see if I could help her with the edits. So I've done some stuff like that in the background, but I don't think that my experience has been much like Kyle's. I think that we have a fairly different core fan base, because while we're both writing furry stuff, we're writing fairly different furry stuff. My stuff tends more towards sci-fi and being idea driven, and his stuff is really character and emotion driven. And the people who love his stuff may or may not come over and be interested in my stuff.
Is that just a personal preference? Is it the style you're more comfortable writing in, or is it is the more sort of character-centric, emotively driven storyline something that you might pursue in the future?
Well, I mean, So I come from a background of loving Star Trek, like so much, loving Star Trek to ridiculous levels. I love these idea-driven sci-fi things where you've got like a Dyson sphere or, you know, a planet that, you know, you just like, whereas it's about the concept, and I start there and then try to figure out what the people would be that inhabit that world and what that's like. So I used to think of myself way back after college as a character-driven writer because I was comparing myself to Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, who are perhaps the least character-driven writers ever, just about. And I'm not a character-driven writer. I mean, obviously, character and plot are two sides of the same coin because you discover who a person is by what they do. But I tend to come at it from thinking about what people do rather than who they are inside. And just, you know, from having heard Kyle talk, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert on what Kyle does or thinks, but it seems like he comes more from a place of knowing who his characters are, like as people. And I tend to be much fuzzier on that. And I hadn't even realized it until I started reading things that were much more character driven and realizing, oh yeah, this is not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is more in the like classic science fiction direction.
All right. Apart from Asimov and Clarke, are there other sci-fi writers that you aspire to or that you use as inspiration?
Oh gosh. I mean, there's so many inspirational writers. So of course my mind starts blanking.
Sorry, no need
Connie
to put you
Willis.
on the spot. Like, if any of them do like pop into your head, you were saying?
When I discovered her writing was just delightful. She writes very spare prose, and I started aspiring to that when I discovered her writing. I always liked, when I was back in high school, I loved David Brin and Mike Resnick. I probably don't aspire to be like them as much now. Although, I mean, David Brin's Uplift books clearly had a huge influence on me because Uplift is the science fiction idea that I now rest most of my furry writing on.
Okay. So with, I mean, obviously with all that and sort of everything like that in mind, I mean, while we were talking about earlier, you mentioned that you took over the sort of position of what exactly in the Coyote Awards?
I guess the chair of the Coyote Awards.
Yeah. What does that sort of entail?
It means that I'm the person who, you know, puts up the ballot, you know, asking people to make nominations and then puts together the ballot, compiling those nominations and tallying them into an actual final ballot and puts that up and gathers the votes. So I do the actual mechanical work behind the scenes.
And with the Coyote Awards, unlike the Furry Writers Guild, or are they in any way similar in the way that they sort of change chairs on a year-by-year basis, or how exactly does that work?
Right now, it's just me running the Coyote Awards, and I don't think that we have a process in place for replacing me. I don't think that it's really a job that anybody wants. I mean, if there was somebody who would do a good job of taking it over, I would love to be eligible, but I don't think that the person doing the background work should be eligible for the award. That's not actually in the rules. No. But I always step down from consideration, and I wouldn't want to hand them off to somebody who wasn't also that. So finding a person who both cares enough to bother doing it and is willing to not be eligible is, you know, it's not an enviable position.
Understandable.
That is very understandable. I have wait, let me see. So obviously the Ursa Majors, I think, I'm not sure if they've finished their voting yet. I haven't actually been keeping tabs on that recently.
The voting's closed, and they're going to be announcing the winners next weekend at a convention in Australia.
Australia, okay. So I mean, like,
I may
WAF,
pay a fair amount of attention to that
which
since I am eligible.
yeah, is that a WAF or which one?
West Australia Fur Fest.
Yeah.
Oh,
Which,
I don't know. It was on the website. I was looking up exactly when
okay.
the awards would be. Know when to check for if they've posted winners.
Yeah. So now the nominations are out there, and I mean, you've been, I think, nominated for quite a bunch of, I think, short stories and fictions and everything that you've placed out there. And I remember, I think, if I'm not mistaken, like my personal vote went directly all the way to everything that you wrote. Um, because I don't know, like
Thank you.
there's a lot of good names out there as well. But the thing is that like I sometimes go with
Oh, there are, yeah.
yeah. And I mean, like, your name constantly, I think, ever since around about, what's it, 2014, roundabout there, continually sort of popped up on the Ursa Majors. And
Yes.
I mean, is it ever a daunting thing to feel like, there's a popular vote out there? I know that many people, for instance, I know that there's a one YouTube channel called Furry Eft. I think,
Culturally
yeah,
Effed.
Culturally Effed, which has been doing like a lot of what do you call it, marketing for their own kind of stuff. Do you ever market for your own books for like something like this? Like, I'm up for the Ursa Majors, vote for me, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I
Or
mean,
yeah.
I'm not sure how people get nominations or votes without doing that. So
Sorry.
I've cut back on it some because since I've been nominated so many times, you want to see lots of different names on the ballot, but I also still I would love to win. I've won once, but it's always a wonderful thing to have your work recognized. But
Yeah.
yes, it is a popular vote, which means it's a very different thing from the Coyote Awards, where I mean, you want to make sure that people in the guild know that your stuff is out there, but then really it's just going to depend on once they've read the stuff what they like, and it's a much smaller pool of people, whereas for the Ursa Major Awards I think the way I ended up on the ballot the first year, which was way back in like 2011, and or maybe 2010, because I think I self-published Otters in Space in 2010, so that was before it was a Fur Planet book. And I'd gone to Rainforest and discovered all these things, and I learned about the Ursa Major Awards. And so I went to my local writing group and writing communities here who had never heard of furry at all and said, hey, there's this online award and my stuff would be eligible. And so you could go nominate Otters in Space. And because writers weren't writing heard of furry fiction, they weren't in competition. They didn't have anything else that they were interested in for the ballot. I'm guessing, a lot of them went and nominated because it's really easy to do. And you tell people that. You say, hey, friends and family, this is easy to do. And so, it's a great way to break on scene, because if you can get people to come nominate you, it means that you're expanding knowledge of the fact that furry is a thing, that furry writing is a thing. And, it's... I don't know. I have lots of feelings about the Ursa Majors.
Okay.
It's a complicated issue. I know people can get very worked up about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, and is that something, because that's obviously always the question is that, like, I mean, there's the entire idea of whether people like the books or whether they don't like the books, whether they know about the books, whether they don't know about the books,
Or whether they're just pushing an author that they know.
yeah. And I mean, like, it always feels like, some days
Right.
you get the right person, some days you don't. And I mean, like, if we look at, say, Carl Gold, I mean, 2010 was 2010. Carl Gold was still, I think, ruling with pretty much every single book that he was publishing at that point.
Otters in Space lost to The Shadow of the Father,
Shadow of the Father, yeah.
believe, by Kyle. Yeah. So that's one of his books that I've read. Because that's curious, what did I lose to? It was a pretty good book, actually.
No, and like, the thing is that, like, I can only imagine. And the thing is that, like, I mean, again, Carl Gold was this sort of well-known already by this point, like writer on the rise, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, obviously he stepped down, what was it, 2015?
I feel like it was earlier than that.
I think it could have
but
been earlier than that.
it was a while ago though. Because I remember coming onto the scene and realizing, oh, okay, if you're up against Kyle, you've lost. And, very early on, I figured that out. And then he stepped down. It was like, oh, now the field's open. Interesting. Yeah. I still didn't win, but it was more of a question.
Yeah. And I mean, again, like if we look, I mean, your name just constantly always pops up. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to speak to you, is because I mean, like, you seem to be, like, I don't know, churning out content on a year by year basis.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's always been very good content.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't have been.
I mean, I think that's a large part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's a large part of why I end up on the ballot so much. I'm editing Roar, and so that it's a different category, and I've had a number of novels come out, but I write a ton of short stories. And I send them out to markets until they find a home. And so I've got short stories coming out all the time lately. And that just means I have more to pick from. And, if you've got more short stories out there, you've got a better chance of getting recognition for any of those short stories.
So, I mean, what was it? The 2014 win that you made with When a Cat Loves a Dog in your short fiction. How, and I mean, weirdly enough, you had, like, I think three entries in that 2014 year, that being a real stand-up
I think it was,
guy.
It was 5 or 6 because it was the whole short story category. So actually,
is the entire short story category.
As soon as the ballot was announced, I knew that I was going to be winning that year. So. Yeah, my experience with Ursa Majors is very strange because I have never actually won against anybody else, but I did win by having so many short stories out that I took over the whole category, which was
shotgun approach.
Weird, very weird.
With regards to your short stories, how does writing a short story compare to writing like a full-length novel? Like, do you prefer one over the other? Is the one just sort of wouldn't say a distraction, but like a palate cleanser from the other? Like, what's your process there?
All right, so I decided that I would like 12. And that's how I saw myself as a writer, and specifically a novelist. I didn't care much about short stories. But I, was in school, and that it's really hard to write much when you're actually in school. So I would write during the summers, and I wrote the start of a novel off of Redwall, and then abandoned it as I moved on to science fiction and wrote like 30,000 words of a novel about tigers in space, and then abandoned that because college didn't leave me even time during the summer. So after college, I saw, but had never actually finished a novel, and I thought I need to learn how to actually finish the fiction that I write. So I'm going to do some short stories, even though I'm not interested in them. And I started writing short stories, and you can send them out to the markets out there. Back then, you'd actually stick them in an envelope with stamps, with a self-addressed return envelope in there. Stamped, self-addressed stamped return envelope. They called them SASEs, S-A-S-E. And yeah, it's really old school at this point. It's really interesting when you get a bunch of writers together and the younger ones aren't familiar with that, and the older ones, did it for years. I did it for like the last couple years that people did that, and now it's all through email.
Yeah.
But
what's a stamp?
Anyway, exactly. So yeah, I was doing that, but I kept thinking, but I should switch to a novel and focus on doing that because that's what I want to do. And you send stories out, you can do it for a long time and get no response other than form letters. And the day that I was thinking, I'm going to be done, I'm just going to stop doing short stories. I've learned what I needed to from them. I got back a rejection from Analog, And Stanley Schmidt, who was the editor at the time, he was the editor for a long time, had signed the letter in blue ink, which meant it was like it had actually passed through the hands of the top editor. And my previous rejections hadn't had anything personalized. And that was, this tiny little thing, but it was enough to give me hope. And so I was like, I'm going to keep sending analog short stories until I sell something to them, which took like another decade. But the point is, it kept me writing short stories. And then when I moved from Seattle to Eugene, I joined the Wordos, which is this amazing story writing critique group. And, they really function on critiquing short stories. You can put novels through the table, but it doesn't work as well. And people learn more from short stories, and it's more interesting to critique something where you can critique the whole thing at once. And the way that this group works, we have to do novels in chunks, and it just isn't as effective. Anyway, basically, I just kept writing short stories until I developed a taste for it. And now I'm addicted to it because it's way faster than writing novels, and you can finish something and show it to people and get responses and feel like, you've accomplished something, and you can add a little number to the list that you keep of how many short stories you've written. Whereas with a novel, it takes at the very least months to write the whole thing and get that sense of accomplishment. And usually, taking months, that's a new thing for me. My most recent novel, I managed to write in 3 months, but before that, they've all taken me years.
Sure. So, if we walk through the process, and I remember I had a creative writing lecturer in university, and one of the things that he continuously told me is that, if I write poetry, that one of the things that I should be able to do is that I should be able to take that poetry and then sort of extend it on a line-by-line basis to begin to sort of turn it from poetry into prose, and from prose into some form of short story, and then possibly from a short story into a full-length novel. He says that this is possibly one of the ways that you can try the different kinds of methods of writing. And I never believed him because I never did it. So, and I mean, because it really isn't that easy to sort of think of characters like that. I mean, you've taken pretty much a hold of a completely different genre in the furry sort of fiction line, where it comes to this idea of this film noir kind of detective-esque stuff. And I mean, how easy would it be to take one of your short stories and turn it into a full-length novel at all? Do you think that you would be able to do that or not?
Well, so I guess for me, it depends. If you've got an idea for a piece, the question is kind of how much time I want to spend with that idea. Is it an idea that you love enough to spend a novel's length of time on it? So I've this idea of taking a poem and expanding it out all the way to a novel isn't one I'd heard before, but I could absolutely see it working. The novel I just wrote, I started it. Do you know about NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month?
Oh yeah.
So it's November, and the idea is to write 50,000 words in November, and it's a great way to jumpstart a project. Anyway, I started a novel for NaNoWriMo where I was using all these characters that I developed by writing flash fiction over the previous year. I was doing this thing, exercise to increase my writing speed, that I had adapted from something a local writing teacher talked about, where he keeps these little story idea books where he just writes down words of and ideas, things that strike him, and numbers them, and then he'll roll the dice and pick, literally roll dice and pick 3 elements from these long lists and try to write something in 15 minutes inspired by those 3 things. His name's Eric Witchy. He's a great teacher. But I adapted that, and I got myself, I was at a toy store with my kids, and there were these storytelling game cards, and they just basically have pictures on them. There was one that was like fairy tale stuff, and there was one with robots, which is great. And I had this deck of animal oracle cards. So I would just draw 3 random cards, one with a robot, one from a fairy tale, and one of an animal. And my goal was to write a whole story before the end of the day. And to do this over and over again, just for practice. See how many days in a row I could write a whole story. And, if you're doing that, you end up with very short stories. So I was practicing writing flash fiction of like 1,000 words. And it was a really effective way to increase my writing speed, but it also turned out to be a great way to generate a whole lot of characters and ideas on, if you're trying to write that fast, you end up reusing the characters over and over again. It's like, I can't think of anything. Well, I'll use that character from yesterday. And, after doing this for a couple of months, I ended up with a bunch of pieces of flash fiction and a bunch of ideas that I then wove together into the novel that I spent last November through January writing.
All right. So Advolf has a question here in respect to your work. He says something along the lines of, he understands that America is pretty much cats and dogs, and Europe is mostly otters.
Right. Well,
yeah.
That's what the cats and dogs think.
Yeah.
They're the cats and dogs. They're kind of ignorant. The school systems are perhaps not great in the futuristic America in the Otters in space world.
Are you sure that's futuristic?
If you actually read the whole trilogy,
yeah,
there's been a process. I started writing Otters in Space. Oh gosh, so it's 2018. Well, a decade ago, more than a decade ago. And I was not as aware in the world at that time as I am now. For one thing, we didn't have Twitter, and, there weren't as many social networks that made it possible to connect with people all over, not just the country, but the whole world. And I had lived a wonderfully sheltered life, very privileged. I wish everyone could have a childhood as great as mine was. But it meant that I really didn't know how bad a lot of the country is, how bad the things are that are happening. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was writing dogs because, I had a dog and 2 cats, and I would watch the dog beat up the cats. Not really. I mean, they were playing. I'm obviously not going to let my pets really hurt each other. But, I had the Sheltie, and Shelties are herd dogs, and they're supposed to keep sheep safe. So if instead of sheep you give them 2 cats, then they're like, hey, cat, get down from up there. It's not safe to be up so high. Mm-hmm. And spent a lot of time barking at the cat. And I had this idea of what it would be like if you had a whole world cats and dogs, because what you always get, and the responses I would get when I would tell people about this idea early on were like, oh yeah, the cats will be running things. No, the cats won't be running things. The cats are very individualistic, and they're smaller, and the dogs are going to come together and form packs and groups, and they're going to be in charge.
Part of like society,
and it was
societies.
Yeah, so I mean, it started out as a completely abstract exercise of what would cats and dogs be like as people, and has turned out to be a very rich world for metaphor for our actual world, which was not originally entirely intended. I mean, I could see little bits of it, but I didn't know. Like, I wrote about Kipper, the tabby, feeling like she couldn't trust the police, who were all dogs, before I had any idea about the things that Black people in the United States face from the police. And that is a privilege, that it would have been easy to say that there it's possible to be blinded by privilege and end up saying really horrible things without meaning to, and once it's explained to you, hey, look at this history, look at what's going on right now and what people are actually facing, and then realize that you're wrong. And I feel very lucky that the book I wrote ended up not being a horrible racist book, given that I didn't know what I was doing. But now that I have a better idea, I feel a much bigger responsibility to be careful with what I write.
Yeah. I mean, like the current circumstances in America with the way that things are going, like, I mean, like how often does like politics in like your book sort of affect, I think, or how much outside politics affect the books that you're writing? How does that does it do that at all, or is it recent that it started happening? Considering that, yeah.
Well, I mean, so I was working on Otters in Space 3, and I had this idea for the character Petra, who is another tabby cat, and by the third book, she's adopted some kittens. And as I was writing this book, I had a pretty young kid. So my son Wesley was like 2 when I was working on this, or 1, very little. And I was having these experiences where just, I was dealing with kids, because I also have an older kid, and she was younger then as well. She's 10 now, but she'd have been, more like 6 through 8 while I was working on the book. Anyway, they'd fight with each other and they'd be difficult, and I put them in the car, and then they're strapped in and they have to stay where they are while I'm driving them to wherever we're going. And it's like the most peaceful time, because they can't be causing trouble. They're stuck in one spot. And I would just find myself like driving in loops, taking extra time to get places, being like, why would I go home yet? Because it'll just be me and them, and they'll be chaotic. If I drive around for another 40 minutes, then Daniel will be off work and I won't be alone with these kids anymore. And so since that's what I was experiencing in my actual life, I wanted to put some of that into Petra's role. She's the sister of the main character. So, you've got your space hero, Kipper, out there doing really exciting stuff. And her sister also, there's important stuff that happens in her plot line, but there's also this sense for her that, hey, my sister's off in space doing exciting things, and here I am driving around in circles with these kittens bickering in the back of the car. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I wanted to capture some of my experience in that, but I wanted to put it into my world. And, in my world, what's going to happen is a dog's going to see her. A dog cop is going to see this cat driving around in circles suspiciously and pull her over. And it's not going to go well. And I had that all outlined. That was what I was going to write when Sandra Bland was pulled over and then killed in jail within a couple days. And it's, yeah. I watched the video because I felt like, oh geez, if I'm writing something that is a similar type of thing, I have a responsibility to try to do this right. And it's a really hard video to watch. It
really is.
We have a real problem with police in the United States, a really big problem. Mm-hmm. And it's horrible, and people need to think about it and be aware of it and do something about it. And I don't know, as one person, you don't always know what you can do. But what I do there is I could try to really write that scene as with the full emotional punch that, this is totally unfair. Petra has done nothing to deserve the treatment that she's getting, and the treatment is brutal. Of course, there's also a tricky line in that these books started out as being aimed at a young adult audience before I knew about the furry audience, and I want them to be accessible to kids too. Mm-hmm. So it was an amazing balancing act. Yeah. I hope I pulled it off. I then actually wrote about Petra's experience. There's a furry dystopian anthology.
Yeah.
That will be coming out sometime.
Okay.
And I wrote a story from the perspective of Petra's husband, who's a dog, and him going to the rally about how unfairly Petra's being treated, and he's got these adopted kittens that he's responsible for, and he is upset that his wife's been arrested, and I was trying to capture it from the other angle, because like Petra, she knows what's going on. She's a cat. She's faced these sorts of prejudices before. Even as a dog who's married to a cat, though, Lucky, that's the dog's name, his first thought is still, what did Petra do to get pulled over? Like, was she not driving reliably? Like, was the turn signal broken or something? And, by the end of the story's whole point is the emotional arc of him realizing how wrong it was to even wonder that, of course, Petra didn't do anything other than be a cat while driving.
Yeah.
Yeesh.
And yeah, that'll be in the Furry Dystopian anthology when it comes out.
Is there a title for that anthology so we can look out for it, or is it still in?
I
under press?
don't know what the anthology is. I'm not sure if it has a title yet.
Okay.
And I'm not sure when it's coming out. Okay. But my story is called Not All Dogs.
Okay.
Post about it.
Huh. And I mean, that must be like, honestly, I'm like mentioning Sandra Bland and everything like that, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, like, being able to comment about it. I don't know. Like, this is if anybody's been following at least like the last couple of podcasts that we've been doing, is we've been trying to find sort of like a way to sort of talk about multiculturalism within the furry fandom. And so, I mean, this actually ties in quite well, sort of that kind of perspective writing from the outside of the actual issues, attempting to sort of at least bring it to light from, I guess, from writers that understand, I guess, the idea of privilege in essence. And and I mean, it's difficult because, I mean, you look at people like what's that rapper's name now? Not Eminem.
Macklemore, the other white one.
The other white one. But yeah, so I mean, like, you look at somebody like Macklemore, and you kind of sit there going, like, yeah, no, this guy exists out there. He wrote 2 songs called White Privilege and White Privilege 2, and like, it's sometimes, and maybe it's the furry thing that may sort of drive the point home a little bit better than something as almost, sometimes it feels disingenuous that we're the ones who have to write about it in essence and say things about it because we're pretty much the only ones who are going to be paid attention to. Because that feels different, doesn't it? It's something that maybe I've been trying to think about for a while now, because a large amount of my poetry these days is sort of this anti-capitalist dross that gets thrown out into the middle of nowhere, and I hope that somebody pays attention every now and again. But I mean, how does that entire sort of thing feel like? I mean, the very fact of the matter is that we're taking on the voice of a people who can't necessarily speak at times.
Well, I mean, I think that furry fiction is kind of, you almost can't avoid having your beliefs and opinions about
it's very difficult
diversity and race and how, I mean, that's going to come out through how the different animals treat each other and interact with each other and what it means that there are different kinds of animals. So you kind of almost can't avoid talking about those issues while writing furry fiction, because what you believe is going to show up on the page somehow. Yeah.
It's very difficult to sort of not necessarily step back from your work, but be aware of your own biases when you do write these kind of things. And honestly, it's a very laudable thing to be able to do that, to look at what you're doing and say, like, am I coming from too much of a sort of white average middle America home, or am I coming from too much of a privileged position to look at what I'm writing and then say, this screams that I know nothing about these people. It's difficult to sort of look past that, or to at least recognize that in your work.
I mean, of course, it is also possible for people who really do know about these things to use furry fiction as the lens through which to talk about them. Well, that was a horribly mixed metaphor. Because, I mean, the fact that you almost can't avoid talking about it with furry is one side, but the other side is furry. It softens things. It gives you this distance. You're able to look at it. I mean, I think that's part of why Kyle Gold's books are as successful and powerful as they are. He's able to write about things that are very emotionally heavy for people. And, well, it's an otter and a fox. So, if you're coming into it not sure how you feel about it, not sure to identify with any of this, it's an easier way in because there's that sort of film between you and thing. It's you're not looking at yourself, you're looking at an otter. Except maybe the otter is a reflection of you. And so it gives you a chance to sort of ease into it. I think so. I edit Roar, and Roar 9 is, I just finished editing it, sent it off to the publisher, and it should come out later this summer. And I think the most powerful story in this year's Roar is actually, it's written by Casey Alpinus, and it's about two puppies who are of different dog breeds in a world where different dog breeds really matter to the dogs, and not all dog breeds are treated as well as others. And I believe that Casey Alpinus is a Black woman, and she has written an incredibly powerful story about her experience, or I mean, not necessarily her experience, but it sounds from her bio like it speaks to experiences of either her or other women in her family. And it's a beautiful story. So, it's possible to speak from actual knowledge. Just all right. These are heavy topics.
No, they are, and
we try and take them on with a little bit of gusto here. We don't shy away from these kind of things because it's relevant, but it's also stuff that people skip over quite frequently. You don't take these things into account in your day to day, and especially when you are a creator, whether it be like writing or music or art or whatever, everything you create does reflect something that you either want out of the world or understand in the world. So sort of reflecting that back into you and having that introspection to do that kind of stuff is something I think more people definitely need in their day to day.
Yeah. Oh, just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and unlike somebody, and not to say anything wrong about it, but I mean, like if you look at Tempo's books, for instance, it's actually kind of very Redwall-y at times, in the way that like the vast majority of the animals can get together if they wanted to. There's many points that say particular animals that were sort of stereotyped as the evil ones tended to sort of move towards being on the good side of things. And it had a lot to do with that. I mean, like you look at the idea of the rats, for instance, especially in the initial Redwall book, or the foxes or the stoats, who used to always be sort of stereotyped in this particular way. Whereas you had all the sort of herbivores, which weren't necessarily herbivores, considering that, like, I mean, what's the word? The fish couldn't talk because they constantly just pulled them out of the lake, like ate them, and kind of sitting there going like, don't. If all of your animals can talk, why can't your fish talk?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I'd never thought of writing Redwall from the point of view of the fish. That could be really interesting.
So it's that sort of the Zootopia question that pops up. Like, if 10% of the population are carnivores, what do they eat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the meat come from?
Yeah, and that's the reason. So, I mean, Redwall, I had no idea when I was young and reading them how problematic they are. And I still kind of want to give them a bit of a pass, although I understand that, Brian Jakes may well have intended the problematic aspects, which makes them even more problematic. But, taking that out and just reading them, there is a level at which it kind of, they're animals. They've got to eat something. Like the movie Ice Age. You get to the end, and the saber-toothed cat just swears off eating other animals. And I'm like, well, you're going to starve. This isn't going to work. So you do have to deal with that in your world building.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Speaking of world building, it sort of leads a little bit into another sort of follow-up question that Outwolf had. As I mentioned, like America's mostly cats and dogs, Europe's mostly otters by the sounds of it. But what does the rest of your world look like? Is there a sort of any particular book that we could read to learn a little bit more about what sort of
about
what
the Otters
rest
in
of what's
Space?
behind the Misty Mountains kind of thing?
Well, if I get to the fourth book, my plan is to have a lot more diversity of animals in that. So the fourth book would involve putting together a space program that's sort of a joint space program and I, haven't done the complete planning for it because I've been working on other projects. But there are actually a lot more animals in the Otters in Space world than the cats and dogs have been paying attention to. There are a bunch of mice living at the base of Big Ben because I thought that was adorable and funny. And I would have to check. But in Otters in Space 3, the main character Kipper learns a lot about the animals that are out there, and it's still basically woodland animals because there was a specific scientist who was behind most of the uplift before the disaster that none of the cats and dogs know quite what happened, and the humans are gone now. So basically, I haven't actually written down those parts yet, although I've done some of the world building in my head. So the most you're going to learn is from reading Otters in Space 3.
Okay. Because, I mean, like, there's obviously now, I'm sort of thinking about, like, other things that could be connected to this, in that, I mean, there's obviously this entire idea that, what's the word? You look at, Planet of the Apes, with the whole genetic sort of modification, and that the fact that the humans eventually become enslaved, and obviously if we maybe move too far forward in time, that the humans eventually get eviscerated for their own hubris. For that matter, I mean, you look at the idea of genetic testing. We have Pinky and the Brain. We have what else is there that involves genetically modified animals?
Well,
oh wait, The Secret of Nim.
Oh yeah.
which I haven't seen yet.
You haven't seen Secret of Nim yet?
I have not seen The Secret of Nim yet.
You
no.
need to see it because
I know it's one of those cornerstone furry fiction things. I know
it's not even about being a cornerstone furry fiction thing. It actually has like a lot more sort of nuance to it, and honestly, it's probably the best non-Disney, I believe, like movie in existence.
Was it not Disney? Who made that?
It was. Look, the thing is that Don Bluth still worked on it, but it was after Don Bluth left Disney.
Yeah,
because the art style is very Don Bluth.
Yeah, it is Don Bluth though.
Yeah,
it was actually based off of a book.
Oh, okay.
Yes. The book's great.
The book's amazing. The book's a lot more. Actually, weirdly enough, the movie is just as dark as the book is. There's blood for starters, and that's obviously not something you'll ever find in a Disney movie.
Yeah, true. I think. Was there ever? I know. I don't know.
Not in the older ones. There was one, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There was blood in Ice. Nothing. Ice person, woman singing.
Frozen?
Yes.
Frozen?
Yeah. Ice woman thing.
Yes. She gets like cut on, like somebody gets cut on the cheek.
Yeah.
And you see blood for the first time in a Disney movie or something.
Was Finding Nemo also Disney or not?
No, that's Pixar. Is it?
Well, there was
Pixar has combined with Disney. Yeah. I don't remember if it was before or after Finding Nemo.
But there was a scene in there where Dory gets a nosebleed and it ticks off the sharks.
Oh yeah.
But that's not a.
I know it's It's nothing major. It's not like someone's getting split in half, but it is
Yeah.
technically still blood.
So I mean, with obviously your gearing of like books and things like that to more sort of youthful people, like I mean, obviously like issues like the ones that you're kind of dealing with already. To what point can you sort of like, I don't know, dumb it down to an extent to make people understand exactly what that is, and that how does one sort of like resolve issues like that for your reading,
Like, yeah,
demographic?
How do you mean? You mean like sort of maintaining your writing style and your integrity to suit the audience, kind of thing, or is that the question?
I think yes.
Well, I mean, I don't think you dumb it down at all for kids. You just explain more clearly, and also, if there's going to be something really painful, like physical damage happening, or you imply it, you cut away, you say it happened, but you don't dwell on showing the blood. So you don't have to dumb it down. You just don't focus as heavily on the darkest aspects. It doesn't mean you don't say that they're there, but there's a difference between saying that it happened and describing in loving detail every horrible graphic bit.
Sort of rounding the edges a bit, I suppose.
I'm gonna put it out there. This is possibly gonna sound a bit un-PC, but I mean it's almost as though, like, what's the word? You're PTSDing it away. Kind of the way that kids would, that this happened, but I've locked it away immediately as it happened.
Yeah, kind of.
I could kind of see that.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I mean, kids, they they need to know about this stuff. I have to talk with my 10-year-old about why there's a school lockout happening, and what led to that. And she needs to know about the racial injustices that are happening in the world. And just, you have to explain all that stuff to kids, and they can handle it. And, in some ways it's easier for them to understand things than adults because they haven't built up all these layers of complexity. And, it can be very simple and straightforward. Like when my daughter was like 6, she, saw me watching a video about a transgender kid and, was curious. So I explained.
Yeah. Mary,
the concept of trans people to her. And it was, it was fine. Yes?
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Sorry, there was just a little bit of a delay in the feedback. Could you just start that again? Your 6-year-old asked out about the video about the trans people you were watching?
Oh, yeah. I just explained it to her, and it was no problem. It, kids can handle learning this stuff, and it's not really that hard to explain things to them.
Yeah.
You just have to be clear, and you don't have to get into a ton of nitty-gritty details. Just tell them the basic facts.
Yeah. It reminds me of this TED talk that I saw a while ago. I'll see if I can find a link to it at some point. About this. It was a lesbian woman who was talking about sort of recounting this anecdote of her when she was still working at, like, I think it was an IHOP or something like that, some chain restaurant in the US. And she, at that point, she had her hair like cut really short, sort of let's call it a tomboyish kind of look. And there was this like 5-6-year-old girl, whatever, came in with her family, and sort of sat down. She took her order, and the girl just sort of blurted out, like, "Why do you look like a boy?" And and this sort of women's studies educated lesbian woman was like immediately, like the whole like sort of armor came on, and she was ready to get super defensive until she realized that she's talking to a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
She was just like, well, I like to wear clothes that I am comfortable in, and I like to keep my hair short like this. And I don't care that I look like a boy or not. This is what I'm comfortable in. And the girl was just like, cool. Can I have a blueberry short stack, please?
Right.
Like,
Yeah,
kids
that's
kids
exactly
don't care
what I'm
about your
talking.
reasoning. It's just like, yeah, okay, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
That's what I mean about it's almost easier to explain stuff to kids. Because,
Yeah.
they just accept that, like, oh yeah, people can express their gender how they want. They don't have to use complicated words like gender. They could just be like, oh, okay, you look that way because you want to.
Yeah.
And it's not as complicated as adults make it. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, there can be intricacies because then you have to deal with historical contexts and big things. There's a reason that I write stuff that's almost YA. I kind of like that simpler world.
Yeah. But I mean, even then, like, even in the most simple worlds, we tend to have the more complicated things happening. I mean, at the end of the day, like, you have characters that go through pretty much full-on existential dread at times. And I mean, like, the thing is that, like, to explain something like that to somebody else at times, like, or at least what your existential dread might be about, kind of like it does become complicated. So in the end, it's just like, they're going through stuff.
Yeah. Doesn't make for bad storytelling.
No.
Like, I mean, BoJack Horseman almost focuses completely on that. And despite how sort of colorful and off the cuff and cartoony that show is, because it is populated half by humans and half by anthropomorphic animals, the show can still get dark.
Very dark.
Oh, so
Every
dark.
episode.
I love that show, though.
I love that show too. It's a great show.
Yeah, I've found myself, like, randomly sort of, like, I think Badge and I were actually watching BoJack Horseman on Friday night before the power went out.
Nice.
And so we were on, like, episode 4 or 5 of season 2, and there was a point that, like, he was going through a thing that, like, I was technically going through at a particular point in my life. And I kind of sat there going, like, I'm going to curl up and die now. Thank you. Like, I can't handle this. And it's just, it's that kind of thing. Like, we make mistakes and we're going to keep on making mistakes. But the thing is that, like, most mistakes are, rectifiable at some point. I mean, like, save some of the more, disturbing ones that we can do. And the thing is that at the end of the day, they're probably still mistakes of disturbed mind at times. It's not to say that people are inherently evil. It's just that, like, they switched off for about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, you do sort of wonder about people being inherently evil sometimes in the United States lately.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like, it's echo chambers, right? I mean, like, you keep telling people the same thing over and over and over again, and the people who you want to believe continually say these things to you, or they're people in power, or they're people who you thought would have brought some form of change. I mean, we're looking at, say, politics right now. You're going to find that people are going to make massive mistakes because of what they believe in currently. I mean, your belief is your belief, but the thing is that it is still a choice. But at the end of the day, sometimes that choice becomes a lot more blurred in the way that one's spoken to, I think. And I don't know, there aren't necessarily always the right words to say to somebody who's... And back to color issues, for instance. I mean, you look at, say, for instance, the Charlottesville shooting. And you kind of you sit there and you're like, okay, cool. So you know what? This guy went into a church, killed a whole bunch of people in church, and he gets sat in his car, like in a cop car. Like, no, like, he gets led out. There's no police brutality. There's nothing happening to this guy. You just shot 36 people. Like, when I first saw this entire thing, I thought, this guy needs to be shot on sight. Like, seriously. Like, he doesn't need a trial. Everybody saw him. Everybody can point him out. That's the guy. Kill him there. Because, I don't know, mob justice kind of thing. But, I mean, like, we can't do that.
I mean, if nothing else, it's proof that cops should be able to not shoot innocent black people who aren't doing anything. Yeah. Because clearly there are the skills available to handle much more complicated and difficult situations. So there's no excuse for the police brutality that happens in the United States.
But I don't know, like, it's choices that we make. It really is choices that we make.
Yeah. but it's informed by a million things that come prior to that choice. Whether it's, I don't know, whether it's chemicals in your brain not acting the way they should, whether it's indoctrination, whether it's a bad mood, whether it's friends that that keep telling you things. I don't know. Or drugs or anything like that. There's a million things that can lead up to that.
Yeah.
That one point in time.
Like, I mean, like there are days that I wonder, maybe one day I'm gonna snap. I just don't know when.
Yeah, ditto.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how you define snap. There are different levels of snapping.
Yeah, but I mean, like we're probably talking about like
I'm putting a dent in someone's bonnet kind of thing.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like probably walking up to somebody and breaking their neck.
Okay.
Because
we've gotten
has work been
very
stressful
dark
recently?
Work has been stressful. Thank you. No,
sorry.
It's yeah. No, this is unfortunately the kind of dark humor that we sometimes walk into.
Yeah.
But I mean, like it's difficult. It really is difficult at times to be sort of calm in situations like that.
Oh,
and that's my issue with it. Is that, like, you know, somebody comes up to me with an AR-15 and does what the hell they do.
Mm-hmm.
That would pretty much be the point that I would snap.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be pretty, and I'd probably be in jail not next to them, because they're...
Yeah. I mean, yeah, cooler heads prevail only in situations where, I don't know, where the lizard brain isn't talking.
Mm.
Well, I don't think cooler heads tend to prevail when there are AR-15s involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, true, very true.
Or at least
that's why we need to get rid of all of them.
Yeah.
Yep. How do we always get onto these topics?
Because the thing is that they're all topical to what we're supposed to be writing about. Like, I mean,
yeah, true.
Like, you look at, say, the books from the 1800s, for instance. You look at your Jane Austen. You look at Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, and you look at what was topical at that time. And the thing is that, like, for starters, there were no podcasts that these people could get onto.
Yeah, true.
There are no letters that we can really sort of look at between somebody saying, like, going up to, like, Emily and Charlotte and going, like, what was going on in your head? You know, this could have, like, brought us to a completely different kind of ideology, because as writers, they brought us at least 3 or 4 steps closer to an idea that really should have been implemented then already. And then we get bombarded, and I think it was in 2015 or 2016, with something now apparently equally as well-renowned in, 50 Shades of Grey, which seems to almost break all of that work down, and in its own sort of sense, that people want to find that easy way of, just stereotyping one person into another perspective.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're talking. Mary.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, it's gotten kind of
Thoughts?
abstract and heavy. I don't really have thoughts on these abstract subjects. We've strayed a little too far from furry fiction for me.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Sorry, we do go a little bit off script quite frequently. So,
It's all right.
no worries. No, it's fine. So, back to furry fiction then. So you're going to continue with the Otters in Space series, at least for the foreseeable future. Is there anything else novel length that you think could be coming down the pipeline? Any sneak peeks?
Well, so, I just had Squirrel Fantasy come out, and I've got a novel that's a science fiction novel. There are enough animal-like aliens in it that it would count as furry, but the main character is actually human, so that was new for me.
Okay.
And I'm shopping that around right now. I've got my fingers crossed to hear back from a publisher I've sent it to. It's a long shot. It's always a long shot, especially if you're sending a novel out to a mainstream sci-fi fantasy publisher.
And not one of the local furry houses.
Right. But I mean, I love working with Fur Planet. They're great.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also like to make an even bigger splash if I can. So, there was an open reading period for Apex, and I sent them this novel I just finished. And, it would be amazing if they took it. If they don't, then I need to start thinking about where else I can send it. But that means I don't know how long it'll be until it's, available for readers. That's one of the hard things with publishing is, you write something and then you put it aside for a really long time before anybody actually reads it.
Until you can find a way to monetize that.
Yeah, well, it's partly about the money but in our culture, money is how you measure success.
Yeah.
So I'm funded by the fact that my husband is in computer science, and computers are a much more effective way to make money than fiction.
Yeah.
So I'm not as much looking for the money, although that's a lovely perk, as I am trying to find the best way to reach readers. And, if you can get into a bigger publishing house, you might have farther reach in terms of who's going to look at the book. Although I think that Fur Planet's been doing an amazing job of becoming more noticed in the broader science fiction fantasy community. So that's really neat.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
Yeah, but I mean, it's good for an author to have their work available in multiple different places so that they're not, depending on just one avenue of reaching readers.
Yeah. No, that's a really good sort of way of putting it. Yeah, it's good to see that. I mean, is it just me or has Fur Planet been sort of quiet recently? Or am I just like out of the loop? I feel like Fur Planet's not been.
No, they're always still around. Like that's the thing. Like Fur Planet is,
Or am I thinking of Fur Nation?
Maybe you're thinking of Fur Nation.
I think that's what I'm thinking of because they've gone under like ages ago.
Yeah.
Or at least it seems like it.
Well, Fur Planet usually has a sort of explosion of titles coming out for Anthrocon, so they might go kind of quiet preparing for that, because they just got sent the manuscripts for Roar 9 and the first Claw, so I'm sure they're very busy dealing with that.
Okay, so they're still looking over that. How much, how often do you? Let me put it this way. Are you in any way sort of involved in the editing process of, do you edit other people's work, or is it mostly just sort of the writing and rewriting part for you?
All right, so as the editor of Roar, that's the only place where I really edit anyone else's work, and I mostly don't end up accepting stories that aren't pretty much done, unless there may be copy editing to do, some minor smoothing, but basically the story is there, so there's not really rewriting involved.
Yeah.
It's just I'll do an editing pass that I then send back to the author with, tracked changes showing what I've done with it. But what I'm hoping is that they'll look at those changes and be like, oh yeah, all of these things are just making what I did clearer. They're very simple and they're all fine.
Okay.
So, my hope is that there really isn't a whole lot of back and forth, because the stories that I get good enough stories that I accept ones that don't need a whole lot of editing. And so at that level, I am doing the copy editing, and I don't know how much Fur Planet does with that after I hand it to them.
Okay.
I mean, they do the layout and the page setup stuff, turn it into an actual book instead of a collection of Word documents.
Yeah. And on the receiving end of editing, like how many times does sort of let's say Otters in Space 3, how many times does that get sent back and forth between you and your editor or the publisher's editor or something before everything sort of checks out there? Because I'm assuming for like, dare I say, like full novel publication or a major release like that, it would probably be a bit of a lengthy process.
I don't know how it is for other authors. In my case, I haven't received edits from Fur Planet. I tend to write stuff that's very smooth and pretty much done. So they may be doing that more with other authors. I don't know. I do know that they've done at least some level of copy editing, because I was talking to Tyrion about my book that's a collection of short stories cat short stories, The Necromancer and Other Magical Cats. And he said that he like made the word griffin spelled consistently across all the different stories, because I apparently spelled griffin a variety of different ways. So, you know, there's some copy editing going on at that level, but there's never been any back and forth. With my squirrel fantasy novel that just came out from Shadow Spinners Press, there were, they sent me some high-level suggestions, and, you know, I made some changes that were, you know, not too in-depth, but like punching up the end a little bit. And, you know, then they sent me back a more copy editing pass with more, you know, detailed changes, and I dealt with all those. So there was sort of a 2 back and forths there.
I wish I could write my master's thesis like that. God, randomly send it in. It's like, oh, no red, thank you.
Yeah.
Away from this now.
Well, my mom taught me writing and grammar and stuff when I was a kid. There's not, you know, a whole lot of that in the schools.
Right.
No,
But
for sure.
but my mom's great at it, and so I was taught really well when I was young, and always have had her editing my stuff. So, you know, you get to where you're just practiced doing it that smoothly.
I've been complaining about that to my students recently, because especially in high school, like obviously it's 5 years from grade 8 to grade 12 over here, and it's the way that it breaks it down. And the one thing that I keep on telling my students is, like, you know what, every single year you guys go into like high school and things like that, you learn Shakespeare and this book and that book and all of this stuff, and then you learn like a week's worth of grammar, and that's it. So you've learned 5 weeks worth or 10 weeks worth of grammar, depending on what kind of school you're at. And
the rest is deciphering the poet's works.
yes. And kind of sitting there going, like, we do need to sort of focus on this just a little bit more for us to be able to communicate, like, you know, how we want to, rather than like how we're kind of...
How Twitter looks.
Yeah. I read an article recently, and I mean, weirdly enough, no offense to Telegram and pretty much anything else, but like there was an article that was written that said that the vast majority, I think about 60% to 75% of kids' language these days is pretty much just emoticons
That's scary.
over the phone. It's not even like mix it and, like, you know, WhatsApp talk anymore. It's literally just emoticons.
Are we going back to hieroglyphics now?
Maybe?
I don't know. I mean, you also see a very high level of discourse on the internet too. So I mean, there's you know, the incoherentness that can happen on Twitter, but then there will also be links to blog posts that, you know, are working at a very high level in terms of putting together ideas, because you can get this experience of talking to people who have had very different life experiences and really listen to the things they're saying, and then build all those ideas together. And I think that we're moving forward, not everywhere at the same rate, but overall, I think there's progress, and that we're not actually, I don't think we're losing the grammar and the ability to communicate in clear ways. It's just, you know, you don't use it all the time.
Yeah. You don't have to write like a doctoral candidate in your day-to-day speech. I don't know. I guess it boils down to understanding where it's important and where it's not. Like I'll throw down a UR for your if in a text message if needs be, but I mean that's not going to sneak into an email to a client.
That's on a word level. I mean, like on a sentence level, if you really think about it, people are always sort of writing at least mostly grammatically correctly. Beyond that, like we tend to write the way that we speak.
Yes.
And that's not wrong. In fact, I'm not sure if you saw it, but there's like a Stephen Fry like thing where he's talking about the English language and the fact that we're like creating new things and new ways to talk to one another should never be stifled.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's the same. I've had this discussion with some people in like about the Afrikaans language. Like, you can be. I quite frequently mix my languages when I'm speaking at home, because there are words in Afrikaans for a lot of the things that I use in my day-to-day life. But if you just like, I don't know, if you force yourself to keep this, dare I say, like stuffy version of a language alive, it's just sort of like keeping it in a trophy case as opposed to actually using it.
Yeah. So what I want to ask, and as a person who may not necessarily read like all of your books, with the different like sort of species and things like that, do they come with their own sort of like languages or slangs that could be like very easily attributed to them? For instance, I mean, like you've got African American English, or Ebonics as they like to call it, in certain parts of America, for instance, where they then use Standard American if they're, speaking at different sort of areas and things like that. Does that sort of take place a large amount of the time in your books at all, or not?
I don't think that you see too much of that, because I only know English, which, is a failure of the education system here. But it means that I'm limited in what I can do with that. And like I said, I started writing these books when I knew way less about the world. So I think there's reference in the first Otters in Space. They travel down through Mexico and to the space elevator. And I think there's reference to dogs speaking a different language when they're in Mexico. Although, honestly, it's been a while since I've read my own book, or at least all of it. Parts of it I do at readings, but, hasn't been that part. Of course, the otters use a language called swimmer's sign. Also, the octopi use a different language that's because they have 8 tentacles and can have a different sign language. So sign language is something that comes up in the Otters in Space books.
Okay. Obviously, on a year-by-year basis, you're obviously gaining more information, gaining more sort of things that you can incorporate into things. Would you ever consider, say, looking at different, not necessarily different languages, but I mean like Creoles of a particular language?
Yeah, it's something I would consider. In the science fiction book that I'm shopping around now, there are alien races from different planets, and they have different languages. And I've written it from the perspective of a human woman who doesn't necessarily know all the languages that she's hearing, and so the book will describe one of the characters going into a language she doesn't recognize, and she can maybe read some of the body language, but doesn't necessarily know what they're saying at those points.
Okay, right. That's actually pretty interesting, because I mean, like it's definitely an avenue to go into, because there's nothing more than embracing like a whole bunch of different languages in different places, because we experience them that way.
Yeah,
and it makes the world feel lived in.
Yeah,
not too fabricated. But
yeah. So what I try to do is work with what I have from my own knowledge, which means that I'm going to have a character who does not know everything and doesn't necessarily know all the language she's hearing, but I want to capture that idea that there are all of these other cultures and languages and peoples happening, and that's a good thing. It's good that there's that richness in the world.
Yeah, no, that's definitely. Like I said, it makes the world. It definitely colors the world, gives it a little bit more feel to it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're actually coming up to sort of the end of the show right now.
We're going for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so obviously there's a couple of books and things like that for those of us who are going to be looking out for them. Obviously, we're going to be rooting for you for the Ursa Majors.
Thank you.
Coming up as well. We
Best
really
of luck.
do hope. Best of luck, yeah. And I mean, anything else that you'd like to maybe speak about, like project-wise, that may be sort of up and coming, coming out soon, readings that you're going to be at?
Anything you'd like to plug?
Oh gosh. well, I mean, I'm going to be at Furlandia, and I'll be doing a reading there. And we'll have the Coyote Awards. The Coyote Awards are a great thing for people to know about. Roar 9 will be coming out this summer. There are some amazing stories in it. So, you know, I only pick stories for the Roar anthologies that I think are just great, and therefore think people should read them because I think they're great. In terms of plugging my own, what?
Well, we'll keep an eye out.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of my own stuff, you know, I've got the Otters in Space trilogy is out, and The Snake's Song, a Labyrinth of Souls novel, is the book I've mentioned a couple times about a squirrel, and it's kind of like The Hobbit, but with a squirrel, and that's kind of fun. It's part of a series of books. Each book is standalone, but they were inspired by this card game a local creator invented. It's Dungeon Solitaire, and it's like you've got a deck that's kind of like a tarot deck. I think you can use a tarot deck, although you can also get the specific deck for it.
Okay.
And it's like playing solitaire, except it conjures a D&D game for you alone as one person without a DM. And it's really a pretty neat game.
That's really cool.
And
that is amazing.
But he's done an amazing job. It's very fun. The learning curve is a little steep for figuring out how to play it, but once you do, very fun. And my squirrel novel, the outline for the plot came from the very first game I played, and it was this epic game. And I was just, having one of the people, because it was a bunch of writers that got together and we were talking about this idea of writing these novels, and one of them knew the rules better than me and was kind of walking me through it. But by the end of the game, I had people watching over my shoulders because it had just turned into this truly epic game, even though it was just the first one I played.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so I just took that and used it as the outline. And I think it turned out really fun.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's available. Also, I have most of my short stories, I reprint them on a website called deepskyanchor.com. So if you want to read short stories of mine, there are a ton of them up there for free.
Sweet.
Well,
I'm totally going to do that now.
Yeah, and we'll plug that in the YouTube link as well.
Yes. Yeah, no, we'll definitely plug all. In fact, if you could, just in Skype, could you actually just drop some of those links there for us so that we can just reference them on the YouTube link for people who may have missed this?
Sure. How about I do that after we stop talking so I don't accidentally mess up? Okay.
No worries.
That's fine.
Good.
So, yeah, that was Mary Loud. She an amazing writer, an amazing sort of conversationalist. We really did love having this chat with you.
Thank you. Fun.
Yeah,
it was quite fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. I mean, we really appreciate it, and giving us a little bit of insight to into your writing methods and sort of how you lens your own how you put a lens on the world through your writing medium is. It's truly inspiring.
It really is inspiring, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been nervous because I'm very shy, but also looking forward to it because, furry writing is just my absolute favorite topic to talk about.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for being on. We'll definitely give you a call again if there's anything that you would like to speak about or anything like that. Maybe any of your new novels that you'd like to put out there, or any new projects that you'd like to look at, or whatever you want to do. Just drop us a line. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
All right.
Sweet. And of course, thanks to all the listeners out there. We will be back to our regularly pre-recorded schedule next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have another an interview with the guys from Rimba Racer coming up, so that's going to be pre-recorded to fit their time scale a little bit better. And and directly after this, or after this, or off in a while.
Maybe within the next 15 to 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, around about 10 o'clock our time.
Yeah,
we'll be playing a little bit of music here on Furry.fm. Yours truly will be putting up a set and everything like that. And
I might barge in and say bye.
Yeah. Alrighty, guys.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We shall see you again next week.
Thanks again, Mary. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.